Hello and welcome to this very, very special interview. Today is Palestine National Lands Day, and we're going to be having an interview with somebody who has been my friend for some time, who's been active in the Palestine movement. She's actually the Ghana National Coordinator of the BDS, which she would explain later. But her name is LYLA ADWAN-KAMARA. You're welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, let's understand what you do. What is BDS?
Okay. So BDS is a Palestinian-led, non-violent international movement started in Palestine, led by civil society actors. More than 150 plus civil society actors came together to start the movement, and it has since grown internationally over the last 20 years. And what it says is that essentially that we understand that a lot of the harm that happens to Palestinians and elsewhere in the world actually is really often driven by economic interests. And we take as the model the movement from apartheid South Africa. And that's certainly something that I remember growing up, you know, going to the supermarket and seeing the oranges from South Africa and refusing to buy them. And, you know, and I'm sure it's familiar to many others as well. So it takes really that movement as its inspiration. And we have chapters all over the world. Ghana is one of the newer ones, has been active for about a year or so. And what it stands for really is B is boycott, D is divestment, and S is sanctions. So boycott is the things that people can do as individuals. So people can decide that they're not going to put their money buying something, a product, from a company that is complicit in genocide, apartheid, oppression, in, you know, supporting the Israeli state, right? So you can refuse to do things like buy Coca-Cola, for example, which operates on illegal settlements, etc. So that's the boycott part. And there are lots of different apps and guidance that people can find online if they want to make a personal decision. But the BDS as a movement, the overall principle is to try to go for key targeted brands rather than trying to boycott everything, because we also know that that's very disruptive and difficult within people's lives. And maybe sometimes the brands that are on an international boycott list, they are perhaps cheaper. People have to also make reasonable household decisions, right? So within BDS, what we do is we have a more limited a set of brands that are targeted, because there's the idea that if people individually target lots of individual things, maybe it won't have so much of an impact. Whereas if people really come together and target specific targets as a collective, then it will start to have an economic impact on those brands. So that's the boycott element. Then the divestment, D for divestment. This is really about exploring what are some of the more institutional relationships which different institutions may have with the state of Israel, and which may be actually upholding their actions and their military oppression and genocide and all of that. So this could be something like your pension fund. Where is your pension fund invested? Where are even, you know, general funds of a company invested? Are they, for example, invested in Israeli war bonds, which sort of fuels the war chest? Or does your institution have a close working relationship with Israeli institutions, many of which are also part of the overall military regime and uphold apartheid and oppression there? So it's about really understanding some of those deeper investment decisions and what kind of complicity your institution, might be your university or your business, what that might have. So that's D for divestment. And then sanctions is really about asking states to take action. And these are not extraordinary actions. These are actually just actions to uphold already existing international law or agreements, etc., right? So it's about saying that actually, just like Russia was banned from the Olympics, Israel equally should be banned from the Olympics, etc. So it's really about asking states to step up and to uphold all of those treaties and agreements and all that they have ratified and signed up to.
What are some of the companies, you know, which are operating in Ghana, which we should be looking at closely?
Yeah, there are a number. So Coca-Cola is a key company, obviously very popular drink, and goes beyond just being Coca-Cola, but they also have, you know, Fanta and Sprite and Minute Maid and several other brands that come under their umbrella. And Coca-Cola, of course, is like a global plastic polluter anyway, has received awards from Greenpeace due to their plastic pollution. But beyond that, they also have operations within illegal Israeli settlements, which, you know, and I emphasize illegal, like this is not just my personal opinion or something I don't like, this is something that is illegal under international law. So Coca-Cola is one, and we have alternative brands here in Ghana. There's not really any reason to go ahead and be buying from this company. Another one would be Carrefour, for example. It's a major French supermarket. It's not in Ghana yet, but last year there was quite a lot of business press talking about how, because ShopRite is going to be leaving Ghana, that Carrefour will be coming in its place. And now Carrefour is highly complicit, unfortunately, with the genocide in Gaza. For example, they have done things like sort of send care packages to the Israeli forces. They have a number of tie-ups, not just at the level of, you know, their franchisee in Israel, but also at the level of at the global company level. They have a number of sort of tie-ups with like digital and AI and other kind of security equipment. So, you know, these things are really direct complicity. In fact, Carrefour is so complicit that the Israeli state officials thanked them for their support, their strong, staunch support for what they were doing. So, you know, this is a company which shouldn't be coming into Ghana, which, you know, if we were really adhering by various sort of agreements that Ghana has signed up to and agreed to, is something that should be completely blocked, you know, so whether it's sort of African Union resolutions or whatever, it's, you know, it just shouldn't be happening. So those are, you know, just two examples. Another third example would be something like Teva, which is a global pharmaceutical company, Israeli-based, and again, which is sort of highly complicit in numerous ways with the state. Yeah.
Now, how does that link to Lands Day, Palestinian Lands Day?
Well, you see, the issue with Lands Day is that this is really about a commemoration, if you like, of what happened in, I think it was 1976, so 50 years ago now. This is the 50th anniversary. And essentially what the situation there was that the land that people owned, the Palestinians owned, in the Galilee, so at the top of Palestine, was being appropriated, you might call it, by the state. I mean, we could easily just say it was stolen by the state. I mean, you know, it was something like 5,000 acres of land stolen, which was the trigger for protests and sort of rolling protests amongst workers and landowners and, you know, Palestinians. And, you know, these protests were consequential because it was one of the first times where there was a major mobilization by Palestinians as like a national body, if you like, post the 1948 Nakba. So it was consequential in that way, and then it was met with extreme force and violence, and there were 6 people killed and many hundreds injured. And so, of course, those 6 individual deaths are enormously tragic, but we also see that there have been many, many more killings before and after by the State of Israel. But this is important, I think, because it is that moment in time where people really came together to mobilize and to say, this is not correct. You cannot just come and just take people's land and use it to build settlements, to, you know, to essentially enforce a system of land theft, oppression, apartheid, you know. So And in fact, it's so consequential as a day that actually in 2018, it was chosen as the day to start what was called the Great March of Return. So this is when Palestinians in Gaza, who by that point had been already under, blockade and siege for many, many years, decided that they would march. So again, another non-violent protest, but that they would march onto the sort of boundary, the fenced, armed boundary of Gaza and demand their legally, internationally, bound right of return. And again, that was met with extreme violence, and those protests went on for weekly for nearly a year. Many people were killed, wounded. There were all sorts of stories about the occupying forces making games out of it, treating it like a video game, seeing how many people they could kneecap in a day, shooting pregnant women and talking about that being, 2 kills for the price of 1 bullet. And, so these kind of real horrors that occurred, and that's as back in 2018. So Land Day itself is consequential because it reminds us that the sort of theft, oppression, all of this is ongoing. It has not stopped. So it's a moment for us to take stock really and to say this is not correct. This can't carry on. And we see today actually just an absolute escalation in settlement activity, illegal settlement building, continued expulsion, demolition of people's homes within the West Bank. And, so it is part of an overall pattern of oppression and land theft.
Now, the land question, some say, is very central to the Palestinian question. When did it actually begin? When did it become such an issue? Is it from the days of Nakba, before Nakba, after Nakba? When did the Palestinian land question become such a major issue?
Well, I think land is a major issue for everybody, is it not?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think the question of land, I think, is completely bound up with the Palestinians' right of return. Under international law, Palestinians have the right of return to go back to their original homes, some of which are still standing, many of which have been destroyed. It's still standing with other people living in them. People have their keys from their former homes. They have their land deeds. My own family, we have our land deeds from land that was stolen from us. So it is hugely consequential, and it's tied up with sort of many aspects of Palestinian culture as well. When you look at the centrality of some of our produce, whether it's olives or oranges, or land is something that is really important for everybody, and yes, for Palestinians as well. It's not something that we should be asked to give up just like that. Nobody in the world is asked to just give up their land.
There have been lots and lots of reports about settlers and their activities, in occupied Palestinian lands and so on. What is the picture? The settlers, what do they do?
Well, what they do, and we shouldn't treat it as something separate from the state either. The settlers go into occupied territories and they establish outposts, and they start to live there. And then because they have established an outpost, then the state becomes involved. The state comes to protect them, because they shouldn't be there. The state comes to connect them to electricity, to water, all resources that actually then are being diverted away from the indigenous population. They come and then they start to build road networks, which can sometimes cut through people's land, people's homes and villages. So it is essentially a way of really expelling the indigenous population and growing the territory that Israel occupies. and it is part of a sort of broader so-called Greater Israel project, which actually looks to secure land in parts of Syria. I mean, they already have occupied the Golan Heights. It looks to secure land in parts of Lebanon, and we can certainly see that there's been a push up into much of southern Lebanon with the displacement of nearly 1 million people. I mean, it's horrific what has been happening there in the last few weeks. Greater Israel potentially covers parts of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. So it's a sort of huge national project to displace many people and to secure as much land and resources as possible. And settlers are really at the forefront of that movement. And settlers have become, in many instances, increasingly violent in their attacks on indigenous populations, on Palestinians. There are many stories coming out currently of really pogroms taking place in towns and villages where settlers will go in protected by the Israeli military forces. They're setting homes alight, burning people inside, they're overturning cars, they're just absolutely sort of I don't know how to even describe it, but just going wild to destroy and to terrorize people. And it's a campaign of terror to try to get people expelled. And so there's like the terror campaign, and then there is also the legal campaign, where then there will be, legal claims and cases trying to take people's land through the court system, which of course is also unfortunately biased against Palestinians. So this is a really troubling development. Yeah.
Just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. ambassador to Israel actually claimed that there cannot be any question of illegal settlements, and that Israel actually is entitled to not just all of Palestine, but generally all of the Middle East.
Well, what can I say? I mean, international law is under increasing threat. We've seen that. We've seen that laws exist, but have been, rolled back and erased. Red lines no longer seem to exist. I mean, the genocide in Gaza has been a genocide of children. 30% of people killed have been children. That is not normal in war. This is not war. And so because what has been happening in Gaza wasn't stopped, it wasn't addressed, international law was too slow, too weak. Now we see that there is this kind of expansion. We see the same kind of actions taking place in Iran, in Lebanon, the sort of destruction of schools, the killing and targeting of healthcare workers. None of these things are normal or correct under international law. So, if the ambassador wants to say that, international law doesn't exist, I mean, perhaps to some extent there's validity to that point, but that doesn't mean that it should be so. And international law, it exists to protect all of us. And we actually really risk, I mean, we already are falling into this kind of might makes right era, which is incredibly dangerous. It means that any state that feels more powerful than your own can come in. They can kidnap your head of state in the middle of the night. They can buy up all of or steal up all of your resources. What can we do? International law is what keeps us all in balance to a certain extent. Yeah.
A lot of times reference is made to the Balfour Declaration. What is this declaration, and what has it done to the Palestinian people in terms of their lands and so on?
I haven't read it. It's a long time ago. It's 1917 or so. But essentially, it is a giving away of land to which wasn't the British. Palestine was under British mandate, but it was not for the British to give that land away. It is a piece of illegitimacy. in my opinion. You know, I don't think we even need to talk about it. But it does, what it does mean is that, of course, the sort of complicity of the UK alongside many other states is of a very long-standing nature, and the UK has a sort of special responsibility to try and address what is happening across Palestine. And unfortunately, there are just many reports of how actually what has been happening is that the British state has been continuing to send arms to Israel. Hasn't really done much in terms of sanctions. You know, there have been a few targeted sanctions. There's been a few delays on arms licenses, but it has not been, you know, really full in the way that it should be. And this is really unfortunate that the UK, which kind of has set off in a way this chain of events, is continuing to support the aggressor in the situation. Yeah.
There are some evangelicals and others who justify what is happening in Palestine on religious grounds and so on. Are you familiar with their arguments, and how does these arguments sit with you?
Well, I wouldn't want to really get into religion, but I think the thing that I would say is that, you know, Palestine is where, you know, we have the birth of Christianity, right? Jesus was a Palestinian by all measures, okay? And we have some of the oldest and most important churches in the world in Palestine. And Palestinian Christians have lived in the country for many generations, okay? And what we have is a situation where just this weekend, for example, Palm Sunday, Christians were prevented from reaching the Holy Sepulchre. And, you know, and this is just part of an attack really on not only Palestinian Christians, but is part of a pattern of attack which really focuses on suppressing religious, spiritual and national life. So, for example, Al-Aqsa Mosque has also been closed to worshippers for the past month or more. And there are many people who are really afraid that actually it's going to be targeted for demolition, and you know, that will be blamed on who knows what. But you know, and this is a really genuine fear that people hold, and it is not out of the ordinary kind of fear to have, because if we look, for example, at what happened in Gaza, churches were bombed, mosques were bombed, including many sort of very historic cultural sites. So I think if people are sort of saying that, you know, this is something that is Christian, or that it's a conflict between Muslims and Christians, I think that's completely incorrect.
Is it reasonable, maybe justifiable, to see the genocide in Gaza as an extension of the land grab?
Yes, because to really appropriate land, you need to expel the people who are there. You need to expel the people who have the connection with the land, who are on it, who are farming it, who are living on it. And at heart, really, Israel, since its inception, has wanted to expel Palestinians. And in fact, there was a report just recently in the press with, I think it was an Israeli lawmaker talking about, I think it was an article in the Jerusalem Post, talking about how the only way to not be an occupier is for the occupied to be expelled from the land. Oh yes. So you know, I think that is what genocide is all about, isn't it? It is about really killing as many as you can and expelling the ones who survive and taking what is left. This is all a piece of, you know, what we saw with, for example, the Gaza Riviera plan, and, you know, various other plans. Even the so-called peace board now is very much talking about that kind of reconstruction effort, but reconstruction for who? I mean, it's not for Palestinians by all accounts.
As a Palestinian yourself, how do you see the peace board? The peace board chaired by Donald Trump.
Yes, yes. Well, it's an interesting name because I'm not sure it really is anything to do with peace. You know, I think it's to do with capitalism. I think it's to do with, you know, economic opportunities for some of those on the board. I think it is about taking control of the land. I mean, look, it's just a new, different type of colonialism. Not even that different, you know. It is about, you know, a set of people being in a room and saying, well, we own this now. We're going to decide what happens to it. Well, you know, what is that except colonialism? And that's what the Israeli project has been about. I mean, it is a settler, colonial, ethno-nationalist state.
Netanyahu sits on the peace board, and there's no Palestinian on the peace board.
No.
What does that say?
Well, let me ask you. How would you characterize it? Because I think I've made my opinion clear.
Yeah, but isn't it strange?
No, it's not strange because it's not about peace. If it was about peace, yes, it would be strange, but it isn't about peace, and so it is completely as expected. Yeah, this is about money, it's about land, it's about control, it's not about peace.
It's about entrenching apartheid,
yes,
more or less. Well, there has been some talk about the need for the Palestinian people to unite, you know, behind the common cause for liberation from apartheid and so on. What's your view on the call for unity? Is Palestine that divided?
Look, we have decades of people really being separated physically, through nationality, you have a whole cadre of people who are citizens of the state of Israel now. You have people who are in the West Bank, you have people who are in Gaza. Now, these places are not physically conjoined. People cannot travel between unless they have special permits. So there has been just many decades of deliberate separation of people as a nation. And deliberate kind of suppression of national movements, including peaceful movements, like I mentioned earlier, like the Great March of Return. And there has just been sort of every effort made to prevent any type of national unity. And yet, I think that Palestinians are unified, but like any people, are not a homogeneous group. And absolutely have the right to have different opinions about the path that is needed to be taken in order to achieve any kind of freedom. And what freedom looks like will be different for people individually depending on their circumstances and their background. It will be different for people in exile compared to people in Gaza compared to everywhere else. So I think calls for unity are sometimes used to, bring about this idea that they are not unified, that it's just, disorganized rabble or whatever. But I don't think that's true. And if you look at something like the BDS movement, like I mentioned earlier, this came about from a coalition of, nearly 200 civil society groups, has grown into an international movement of 20 years standing. And, this is absolutely not just unity within, among Palestinians, but also international solidarity, which I think is actually something that is really important to consider alongside the idea of, Palestinian unity, okay, but also within sort of the international body, we absolutely need, some really strong solidarity and support.
Now, looking at Palestine today, the intensified conflict, the mass suppression, the genocide, and so on. Are we right in concluding that Oslo was a failure?
It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know what the future looks like. The efforts of, for example, settlements like we spoke about, the sort of Greater Israel Project, all of these things really mitigate against the idea of two-state anything, and it has really changed the sort of de facto reality on the ground. And so where do we go from here? I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm not somebody that is sort of in the know or a power broker or a power holder in any way. So my opinion is just that we need to find a way forward. We need the genocide to stop. We need the apartheid system to be dismantled. And then we need to find a way forwards.
But those in charge of Israel now say that they would no longer accept a two-state solution.
Well, I'm not sure they ever did, because, as I say, all of those kind of land grabs, appropriation, thefts, all of that is about changing the de facto reality on the ground. So, it's no different to, Defense Department being renamed Department of War, right? Okay, so now we're saying things as they are. Okay, so let's say things as they are. But, I still think that we need to be hopeful and committed and to use the small power that we do have as individuals to push towards a more lasting solution. And that's why I'm part of the BDS movement, because, I can't change the minds of a politician, but I can work with others to, boycott complicit brands, to kind of hurt them in their pocket where it matters. Money matters, right? We see that with the issues with the increase of the oil price because of the conflict now with Iran, and everybody's shouting, everybody wants a solution. Oh, we must open the strait, we must reduce. Okay, money talks, and that's why the BDS movement is so important, because it is about targeting complicity directly economically, and we can do that as individuals.
Now, LYLA, there's so many people like you around the world who are not politicians, who perhaps do not even consider themselves as being powerful and so on, and yet have a strong abhorrence for racism, for apartheid, for colonialism, and so on. Now, people like that, what can they do today? People like that around the world. What kind of commitments can they do? What kind of actions can they take in order to bring about the restoration of sanity in Palestine?
Yes. Well, I think the things that people can do, they're kind of on several levels, right? So there's the individual, there's the community level, and then the more sort of global level. So on the individual level, it is about your individual personal moral choices, right? It is about where you work, where you study, what you buy, how you engage with people. All of these things are really, really important. And it's about continuing to break the silence really around the genocide, because, yes, we're talking about this today on TV, but, in many contexts, people just don't want to talk about Palestine. They don't want to talk about Gaza, but it's incredibly important. As we've seen, it is kind of litmus test of international law. So it is about making those personal, individual decisions in speaking up, and in your purchasing, and in all other aspects where you have individual control. And then at the community level, there are many things that people can do if they band together, in existing groups or new groups, organizations, all of those things. So, for example, within the BDS movement, we have something called apartheid-free zones. And there's more than 1,000 of those around the world now. And any kind of organization, it can be a very, very small group, it can be a larger organization, but they can pledge to become an apartheid-free zone. And it's a pretty simple process, because all that we ask organizations and groups to do is to kind of pledge to be apartheid-free, which I think is a pretty reasonable ask. And we can, and then, you know, work with their local BDS group to ensure that within their group purchasing and organization that they're not sort of supporting any complicit brands. You know, for example, do they have a whole bunch of HP computers or something that, you know, as they need replacing over time, we would want them to replace those with other less complicit brands. So that's apartheid-free zones. And then more on the global level, it is about joining your voice to those global kind of campaigns, you know, and really to be speaking out against what is happening, to use your vote, to, you know, all of the things that are really important. And we can see the power of different sort of workers groups as well around the world. So there have been many examples of workers, for example, at the ports refusing to unload ships that are carrying arms to Israel, refusing to unload fuel that is on its way to Israel. So, you know, and people do have sort of that sort of grassroots power if they choose to use it and sort of come together to use it.
LYLA, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming.
Appreciate it.
Well, we're talking to LYLA ADWAN-KAMARA, who is the national coordinator of the BDS movement in Ghana. And we're talking about the Palestinian Lands Day, which actually falls today. And I hope that we've been able to bring some facts to you, some analysis to you, which makes it possible for you to understand the Palestinian question better. We will certainly be meeting again, and we'll be talking about Palestine and so on. But until then, keep your dial on Pan-African Television, which brings you the best, including this very exclusive interview with LYLA. Thank you. It's bye-bye from all of us, the producer of the show, George Viner, and from Adam Lumo, who directed the show. Bye-bye. See you again very soon.